Good day and welcome to our series, part 2 of an overweight and obesity series sponsored by the Arouca Seventh-day Adventist Church Health Ministries Department for 2021. Today, we will be focusing on the causes of obesity as it relates to nature versus nurture. I am your presenter, Katia Knight's Diet. Today, we want to focus on some thoughts and myths about obesity. We want to define and discuss hunger, appetite, and satiety. We also want to be able to look at the basic physiology of hunger and discuss the biology and the genetic factors that affect obesity. And then we want to pay some attention to and explore the socioeconomic influence on obesity as it relates to culture and an obesogenic environment, lifestyle, and finance. So as we get into it, I hope that you find it informative and that you can use the information and apply it to your life so that you can improve your life and you understand what is happening with you. And if not with you, to give some advice and encouragement to someone else. So here we go. Let's talk about some thoughts and myths about obesity. I'm sure you may have heard or you may have thought of it yourself. So, for example, if you're obese, you lack self-control and you're lazy. Sometimes we see obese individuals and we think to ourselves, he or she had to be really lazy or have absolutely no self-control. We also think if you're obese, you can blame your genes. How many of you have heard this one? My family, big bone, you know, we are big breed. Yes, sometimes we hear that and we say that. And then there's the whole issue of lack of access to fresh fruits and vegetables along with high prices. And these are considered or thought to be responsible in some way for the obesity epidemic that the world has at this time. Then there are problems in not so much as some people say in what we eat or how much we eat, but the fact that our lives have become too sedentary. And in that way, the amount of calories that we put in is no way close to the amount of calories that we put out, lending to obesity. And then there's the issue of, the need for education about diet and nutrition. Let's talk about it. But before we do, let's make sure we understand when we talk what we are saying. Appetite. When you think of appetite, according to Merriam-Webster's dictionary, is any of the instinctive desires necessary to keep an organic life, especially as it relates to what we desire to eat. So the key word here is desire, instinctive desires. An inherent craving, such as an insatiable appetite for work, or it speaks to taste or preference. So in some regards, this is often driven by cultural appetites. And then we can talk to hunger. When we say hunger, because sometimes we use the two interchangeably. Hunger, according to the dictionary, says it's a craving or urgent need for food or a specific nutrient, and an easy sensation occasioned by the lack of food, a weakened condition brought about by prolonged lack of food, and a strong need or desire for something that is deemed essential to life. And right here is where we can see a little overlap between hunger and appetite, a desire for something. But in this case, it's essential for living. But for the most part, when we talk about hunger, we're talking about the need for food or nutrients or that would be necessary for us to live, and not so much a desire for it, but a need. And if we're talking about obesity, then and which speaks directly to appetite and hunger, then we must talk about how do we turn that off, that need to have food and to satisfy appetite. Well, that's where satiety comes in. And here we see the definition. It speaks to being gratified and feeling full. And if we're talking about control or understanding rather the causes, then we cannot do so without speaking about the hypothalamus. Now, the hypothalamus is an organ that is situated in the forebrain, and it has a lot of responsibilities, inclusive of controlling our body temperature. Of course, you see there thirst and hunger and other homeostatic systems controlling those. It takes care of it looks after the way we sleep and those sort of sleep patterns and our emotions. And in our diagram next to that, for those of us who need that sort of drawing to bring things home to us, we can see some of the several things that the hypothalamus is responsible for. So just to name a few, you can see that regulating, controlling one's appetite. And I want to point out also sexual behavior, other behaviors, emotional response as well, or different physiological cycles such as sleep and wake. And therefore the hypothalamus is crucial to the issue of understanding obesity and possible causes of obesity. So let's talk about how it actually works. And this is a basic physiological explanation of hunger, as we focus on two very crucial hormones that work with upon the hypothalamus to control what we understand to be hunger. So first, let's look at ghrelin. Here's ghrelin. It's a hormone, and it's produced and released by the stomach when it is empty, or when there's low blood sugar levels in hypoglycemia or very low body weight. It sends a message to the hypothalamus, triggering that hunger response, telling the body that you're hungry, you need to eat something, you need to provide fuel. This stimulates the appetite, in other words, that desire to eat. And the thing about ghrelin is that it often stimulates us to eat things that we like. And I guess that's only natural, because if the body is saying, I need fuel, then the fastest way to get it is by having the person go after something that they enjoy having. And that way they're going to have more than enough of it so that I can supply the need that my body is calling for. But ghrelin also acts upon the stomach, and therefore it helps the stomach to prepare for the food that it is anticipating that the hypothalamus has said needs to come. And therefore, we're going to see that the stomach is going to begin creating those sort of hunger pangs that you feel, grumbling of the stomach and excessive secretions of gastric juices, and you feel that all entire motility and so on happening. And therefore, when that happens, we begin to look for food. Now, the opposite of that is once the stomach is distended so that it's full, we no longer secrete ghrelin. So I remember I had a friend, whenever she felt hungry, especially if she wasn't able to have something to eat right away, she would fill up her stomach with water. And in that way, it would sort of mimic this full stomach feeling, and ghrelin would decrease in its production and secretions. But let's say that, ghrelin is in the bloodstream and it's sending messages to the hypothalamus, and you're feeling to eat and you're eating and so on. How do we stop? So this is where leptin, or the satiety hormone, comes in. Now, leptin is secreted by the white fat cells and some cells of the small intestine. And it is induced when there are high levels of insulin. And therefore, when we eat, and food is supplied, insulin is secreted so that it can transfer those energies that is provided by the food into the cells so that we can maintain life. Once those insulin levels go up, leptin is triggered. Leptin tells the hypothalamus, it stimulates the hypothalamus, and it tells it it's time that, I'm full, there's enough energy and supply available, so you don't need to eat anymore. And that's when we stop, or we should stop eating. And therefore, if you see when we eat, after a time, everyone would come to a point where they would stop eating. And this can vary for individuals for different reasons, which we'll talk about in a little bit. And it's interesting to note that sometimes when you're eating, you feel full and you say, oh, I can't have any more. But then someone says, do you want some ice cream? And all of a sudden, there's room for ice cream. And it seems to suggest that although there's a feeling of satiety, it seems as though there is also sort of a specific level of satisfaction for certain foods that can come. So you may feel like I've had enough macaroni pie. I don't want any more macaroni pie. But if you did give me, let's say, some fried rice, I'd prefer that instead. Now, how does leptin and ghrelin directly affect the hypothalamus? Well, the hypothalamus has two separate receptors, one for ghrelin, sorry, and one for leptin. And as it is stimulated, depending on which one has the greatest influence, it tells us what to do. Now, then we say to ourselves, then how is it that we can just overeat then? Or people can just have and not realize it's time to stop? Well, let's talk about that a little more. You see, if there's increases and decreases in sensitivity to these hormones, then that's how we're going to see that we can start finding obesity stepping in. And it's really a matter of nature and nurture. When we speak about nature, we talk about the biological and genetic factors of obesity. And there are lots of things that play and counterplay to determine how much we eat, when we eat, how much when we stop eating. But today we just want to look at two particular genes that directly affect that. And we're also going to generalize on the hormones as it relates to the nature of our issue of eating and obesity. So we have two main genes that are mentioned here, and I'm not going to really spend a lot of time going into the details, except to say that with the FTO, or the fat mass and obesity associated gene, what it does is it sort of makes it difficult if it's in large amounts, if it's produced in large amounts, for an individual who has this situation to know that it's time to stop eating. They feel very lethargic. They're more, would prefer to be more sedentary and not active, and they would tend to have more or be desirous of more unhealthy foods. And the same would apply for persons who have this melanocortin 4 receptor gene. Again, this produces that feeling of hunger. And if this gene in any way is mutated or hyperactive, you can find that individuals with these two particular types of gene would have difficulty controlling appetite, controlling satiety, and when to stop eating. And then there's the other side of it when we talk about, and there's, I shouldn't say the other side, but there's also the issue of hormonal control. And from this diagram here, you can see that there are several hormones involved in controlling hunger. But I want to point out to you that out of the 6, 4 inhibit hunger, as you can see here, and only 2 stimulate. And here we see the leptin and ghrelin that work antagonistically to each other. And there are lots of other hormones involved, insulin and peptides and so on. We're not going to go a lot into the physiology of them all, but I just need to mention that they all need to work effectively. In other words, there mustn't be any over-secretions or under-secretions in inappropriate times if the issue of managing obesity is to be controlled. Now, as I've been mentioning, if nature is disrupted, so although we have all these checks and balances that is meant to ensure that we do not become obese, the fact is that there are times when it does not work as the way it should. So we have genetic disorders like Prader-Willi syndrome, where the individual can't tell that they are constantly feeling hungry, even though they've eaten. And that's because of a chromosomal defect in the gene. There's hormone insensitivity and overproduction, as in the case of insulin resistance, or injury to the hypothalamus. If the hypothalamus is injured in any way, let's say through accident or chemicals, as the case might be, then the hypothalamus in itself is not able to receive messages adequately and to respond, and therefore it could become troublesome for the individual to control eating and appetite, and therefore can lend to obesity. But you'll hear more of causes of obesity as it relates to diseases and disease conditions at our next session. So please remember to tune in. Let's talk about nurture then. And when we talk about nurture, we're talking about socio-cultural and economic factors. And specific to culture, finance, obesogenic environment, lifestyle, and socialization. When we talk about an obesogenic environment, the definition here, and this is a very early definition, it speaks to an environment that promotes gaining weight and one that is not conducive to weight loss within the home or the workplace. So this environment, some contributing factors, and you can look around, as I've said it, you can look around and see, we have advertising that is meant to pull you into having easy and affordable access to high caloric foods, as well as large portions and upsizing of portions as rewards for purchasing food. And then there's a lot of money that is spent on advertising and appealing to the senses. Very little or no physical activity is also the other spectrum of this obesogenic environment, where we find that simple things that used to be have changed. And I have just two examples here. Just for example, and the issue of transportation. I remember as a child, we would have to walk to school, walk to church, walk to go by friends, walk to go to, if we wanted to go out and play in the playground. Today, we have easier access to transport, and lots of people drive their own vehicles. And if you do have to travel, most times the transportation is a very, very short walk, probably even outside of your doorstep. So those basic bits of exercise and physical activity that should have come with a routine day no longer exist. People take the elevators and then, they park very close to the mall entrance. And I have had the experience where I would go to the mall and drive around until I could get a park as close as possible to the entrance. And then, of course, there's the issue of things like change in physical activity as it relates to entertainment and recreation. We are more engaged in spectator type entertainment and recreation, like movies and concerts and sitting and just viewing rather than participating in activities. And here you can see that little logo, Burgers and Pizzas, open 24 hours. So anytime you feel that urge, that appetite steps in, you can have access to these foods that are very high in calories. And then what are we doing at the end of having such a large intake of calories? Well, sedentary lifestyle is a segue from obesogenic environments. Lifestyles that involve very little exercise, very little strenuous types of activity, the lack of play with children and even with adults. I have seen where technology and advances in technology, as good as it is, because here I am talking with you, it has also had its detriment on the type of lifestyle that we live. As you can see in the picture below, children would be playing outside, playing leapfrog over each other and getting that physical activity and riding their bikes. And unfortunately today, a lot of that activity has been reduced to sitting at home in front of the television. I have actually seen a young boy flying a kite on his tablet. And I felt so sad because flying a kite is all about getting out there, getting that kite up into the air and letting the wind take it and you run and control it. And it speaks to a lot of issues, lack of time. And we can't ignore the increase in crime where parents are concerned and adults are concerned about being outdoors and being exposed for fear of being a victim of some sort of criminal activity. And then, of course, there's the issue of COVID-19. COVID-19, I'm sure the studies are being done, and some have already been done, that shows with the event of COVID-19, obesity and the effects of obesity definitely have shot up. I know that personally, I have also, I've fallen prey to some of that overweight spin-off from COVID-19 and the restrictions and the having to be at home, decreased activities, whatever little you were getting, it's almost down to zero. And then, of course, if you're home and you're watching TV as your form of entertainment, and then you're having something to eat to pass the time, we can see that our sedentary life has shot through the roof with the event of COVID-19. We must also talk about finance. These two pictures are very interesting to me. Poverty in the Great Depression, and you can see these gentlemen are emaciated. You can see that they're not very well nourished. Yet poverty today, we see a very plump young lady with lots of energy stored. And one must ask themselves, how is that? Well, study was done to determine how relevant was finance to the obesity issue in the US. And what was done, $1 was used, and at the end of it, the results showed that $1 was able to buy 1,000 calories of cookies and potato chips, but the same dollar was only able to buy 250 calories of carrots. And the same happened, there was $900 of 900 calories, of soda, yet only 170 calories of pure orange juice. And if you are strapped for cash and you need to get that ghrelin relieved, one would want to go for foods that is going to give them the amount of calories that the body is calling for, and often at the expense of rather getting something nutritious, because the body is calling for the calories, it's calling for the energy. And therefore we would go with what gives us the most calories, but not necessarily the most nutrients. The other issue of finance is that folks who are working in lower income jobs may have to do 2 jobs, sometimes 3. And that in itself provides an environment where they can't afford to prepare healthy meals at home, and so therefore they're going to go off for those same high calorie foods that's readily available out there because of that obesogenic society that we're in. And then they can't exercise because they're just too tired to get to go out and in a free park, much less to pay gym fees. So we see a cycle that is created that lends to a sort of obese lifestyle. But it's important to note that the poorest of the poor are not obese. And these are folks who do not even have the money to stretch the dollar to buy high caloric, poor nutritious types of food. So these individuals tend to usually be show those signs of what traditional poverty would look like. Then we must consider culture. How does culture cause or is a causative agent for obesity? Well, culture speaks to, according to the Oxford Dictionary, about customs, beliefs, and social behavior of a particular people or a society. Well, if you reflect on your own situation as Caribbean people, we have the idea of large servings as being expected. And we expect that I get a large serving. You know, if I go to a restaurant and they chinks on anything there, we feel cheated, and we can almost get angry and upset and say, listen, I paid for food, you better bring it on that plate. And then there's the custom of high salt and fats and spices and carbohydrates that relate to that taste. So the appetite for salty, high fat, high carbs is part of the culture of how we eat as Caribbean people. And therefore we can see that appetite is really affected by our culture. And remember, appetite, as we defined it before, was that desire for something. And remember, ghrelin lets us go behind the things that we like. So we can see that the obesity cycle keeps spinning. And what about our beliefs? Well, often we believe in the Caribbean situation that well nourished, which should be in quotes, equals overweight. You know, if we see a sort of fat baby, as we say, we would say, "Ooh, that's a nice healthy baby, cheeks fat and rosy." And the opposite is true. If we see someone who is within their normal body mass index, as we learned the last session. And by the way, if you didn't take in the last session, you can go back where we began and spoke about BMI and obesity, etc. And if we see such a person, we would say, oh boy, this person, like, they're suffering, how they're so skinny. That time the person is well within their body mass index. So the belief about what well-nourished means lends to a sort of overweight, bordering on obese sort of situation for us as a people. And then, of course, there's social behavior. Most, if not all of the time, social gatherings center around food. We do not get together, or we won't get together for long if there's nothing to eat. We have food at our funerals, we have food at weddings, we have food at church, we have food if we just drop by to see someone. There is something to be given to eat. And all of these result in overeating based on the cultural context. So we have to understand the way the culture lends to obesity as well as a cause of obesity. So having said all of this, it's important to understand that obesity results from the energy imbalance that occurs when a person consumes more calories than the body is burning. And these calories must be stored, and they're stored as fat, lending to obesity. An explanation of the causes for obesity must be considered from both a genetic and biological perspective, as well as an environmental perspective, nature and nurture. Family health history reflects the effects of shared genetics and the environment among relatives. So when we say that, you know, the whole family is a sort of big family and everybody is a little obese or healthy or big boned, genetics, yes, and we have to understand that environment as well has its part to play. And while families cannot change genes or defects in hormones, or injury to the hypothalamus, which we also discussed as possible causes, the environment and the socio-cultural and economic factors must also be considered when we are addressing and when we are looking at causes of obesity, and by extension, looking for solutions. Some food for thought. Proverbs 25:16 says, "Hast thou found honey? Eat so much as is sufficient for thee, lest thou be filled therewith and vomit it." In other words, God has been admonishing us from the beginning to have sufficient. But how much is sufficient? And while God placed all the checks and balances to help us know what is sufficient, especially as it relates to food when he created us, sin, however, has disrupted the nature God gave us and has made it difficult to determine when we have had sufficient. And we spoke about all those causes. We spoke about the genetic factors, the hormonal factors. We spoke about environmental factors, and we spoke about culture and socialization, and the way all of these work together to cause us to not know when it is sufficient, lending to obesity. And this sort of obese epidemic that we're seeing is further complicated by the way that we nurture ourselves. We've been nurtured, and the way we continue to nurture ourselves, where we continue to overindulge because of this obesogenic environment that most Western societies are privy to and will live under. But Ellen White admonishes us, food should be chosen that is best supply the elements needed for building up the body. In this choice, appetite is not a safe guide. We cannot safely be guided by the customs of society. Very important to note. The disease and suffering that everywhere prevails are largely due to popular errors in regard to diet. Ministry of Healing, page 295. As I go, I leave you with these words, and I encourage you to join us for our next session as we look at causes of obesity as it relates to disease process. Psalm 193, verse 14 says, I will praise thee, for I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Marvelous are thy works. Is anything too hard for God? No. So we must be hopeful. Until next time, thank you.